In the late summer of 1948, a group of military intelligence officers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base finished writing a document. It was classified top secret. It was the product of a year of investigation, hundreds of sighting reports, pilot testimony, radar data, the Scandinavian ghost rocket files, the Chiles-Whitted encounter, the Twining Memo that had launched the whole investigation in the first place. They titled it, "The Estimate of the Situation." Its conclusion was extraordinary. The objects were real. They were not American. They were not Soviet. They were, in the assessment of the United States Air Force's own intelligence analysts, likely extraterrestrial in origin. The document was sent up the chain of command to the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt Vandenberg. Vandenberg read it. He rejected it. He cited lack of physical proof, and then he ordered every copy destroyed. The Air Force later denied the estimate of the situation had ever existed. Last episode, we ended with a question. If the estimate was wrong, why did they have to destroy it?
This is Unresolved Signals, an AI-powered investigation into the oldest open question in human history. Every document, every country, every question, every release.
Every source cited in this episode is linked on our source page at unresolvedsignals.com. The primary source for the events in this episode is Captain Edward J. Ruppelt's 1956 book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Ruppelt was the first director of Project Blue Book and had direct access to the files, the personnel, and the institutional memory of the investigations he describes. Additional material comes from the CIA's published history of its role in the study of UFOs by Gerald Haynes, the AARO Historical Record Report submitted to Congress, declassified FBI files at vault.fbi.gov, and congressional testimony. We should state something clearly at the outset. No copy of the estimate of the situation has ever been produced or declassified. Ruppelt's account is the primary source for its existence. He is a highly credible witness. He was a decorated combat veteran, an aeronautical engineer, and the man the Air Force chose to rebuild the investigation after the period we are about to describe. He had no financial motive to fabricate. But he is a single source. Historian Greg Agigian has pointed out there is little to no evidence of such a memo. Folklore historian Curtis Peebles called it probably the most controversial document in the early history of the flying saucer myth. In 1966 congressional hearings, L. Mendel Rivers asserted no such estimate had ever existed. We present what Ruppelt said. We present the circumstantial evidence that supports it. We present the counter-arguments. You weigh it. The story begins with a document that is not in dispute. On September 23, 1947, Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining, Commanding General of Air Materiel Command, sent a classified memo to Brigadier General George Shulgin at Army Air Force's headquarters. We read from this memo in Episode 2. The subject line, AMC Opinion Concerning Flying Discs. The 11 words that open the findings, the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. But it is the distribution list that matters for this episode. Twining directed that information be shared with the Army and Navy Research and Development Board, the USAF Scientific Advisory Group, the Atomic Energy Commission, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, Project RAND, and the Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft Project at Oak Ridge. 6 separate agencies and programs. This was being treated as an intelligence problem of the highest order. Twining recommended that Army Air Force's headquarters issue a directive assigning a priority, a security classification, and a code name for a detailed study of the phenomenon. The directive was approved. By late 1947, the investigation had a name, Project Sign. Project Sign was established at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, initially under the name Project Saucer. It was created at Twining's specific request. The mandate was clear: collect, collate, evaluate, and distribute within the government all information relating to sightings of unidentified flying objects on the premise that they might be real and of national security concern. On January 23, 1948, the Technical Intelligence Division of Air Materiel Command formally assumed control. The initial operating theory was Cold War specific. The objects might be Soviet secret weapons, advanced hardware built from captured German technology. This was the same hypothesis that had driven the Swedish ghost rocket investigation 2 years earlier and had been abandoned by every country that examined it seriously. The Air Force also brought in outside expertise. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer at Ohio State University, was hired as the project's scientific consultant. Hynek would become one of the most important figures in the history of this subject. His evolution from committed skeptic to the leading scientific voice calling for serious investigation would unfold over 2 decades. At the start, he was what the Air Force wanted him to be. In his own words, a pronounced skeptic. He would later say that his early work for the Air Force consisted largely of finding conventional explanations for reports he had not investigated. That would change. But in 1948, Hynek was exactly what a skeptical institution needed: a credentialed scientist who could give their conclusions the weight of academic authority. We will follow Hynek's full arc later in this series. For now, he enters the story as background. Through 1948, science investigators collected several hundred reports from both government and civilian sources. They interviewed pilots, radar operators, and ground witnesses. They applied standard intelligence analysis procedures, and certain cases resisted every explanation they could construct. On May 7, 1948, witnesses in Memphis, Tennessee watched 50 to 60 metallic objects racing across the sky in a line, making zigzag movements. The objects moved in formation, changed direction in unison, and disappeared. Then came the case that would push the investigation past the point of cautious agnosticism. On the night of July 24, 1948, Eastern Airlines Flight 576 was flying at 5,000 feet near Montgomery, Alabama. The pilot, Captain C.S. Chiles, and the co-pilot, Captain John B. Whitted, saw an object heading directly toward them. It passed close to the aircraft on the right side, angling gently upward, and disappeared into a cloud. What they described was not a meteor. It was not a conventional aircraft. It was shaped like an airplane fuselage with no wings and no tail. It was estimated at 100 feet in length, with a barrel diameter 3 times the width of a B-29 bomber. It had 2 rows of windows or ports along the side, glowing with a brilliant light from inside. A deep blue glow emanated from the underside, and an orange-red flame trailed from the rear, extending 50 feet back. Both pilots filed detailed reports independently. Their descriptions matched. A ground crew member at Robins Air Force Base in Georgia reported seeing the same object from the ground at about the same time. For the investigators at Project Sign, the Chiles-Whitted encounter changed the calculus. These were experienced commercial airline pilots, flying at night, with clear visibility, reporting an object at close range. The details were specific, internally consistent, and corroborated by a ground witness. Whatever this thing was, it did not match any known aircraft, any known missile, or any known natural phenomenon. The Sign investigators had gathered their evidence. They had analyzed it using the procedures available to them, and they were ready to write their conclusion. The estimate of the situation. According to Ruppelt, the document was written by the project's director, Captain Robert R. Snyder, and other Sign personnel. It drew on the accumulated evidence, the sighting reports, the pilot testimony, the radar tracking data, and the classified intelligence from abroad, including the Swedish Air Intelligence Assessment. Swedish officers had told visiting American officials their conclusion about the ghost rockets. High technical skill, which cannot be credited to any presently known culture on Earth. The estimate reached 3 conclusions. 1. Flying saucers were real craft. 2. They were not manufactured by the United States or the Soviet Union. 3. They were likely extraterrestrial in origin. The document was classified top secret. It was sent up through channels to General Charles P. Cabell, who had recently been appointed Director of Air Force Intelligence. Cabell found himself presiding over what Ruppelt described as a split house. Some officers at the Pentagon were sympathetic to the conclusion. Others rejected the idea of interplanetary craft as impossible, regardless of what the data showed. Cabell submitted the estimate to his superior, General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff. Now, here is where the Vandenberg paradox from our previous episode becomes unavoidable. In 1946, Vandenberg was Director of Central Intelligence. In that role, he personally wrote a top-secret briefing to President Truman about the ghost rockets over Scandinavia. He took those objects seriously enough to brief the President of the United States. He was aware that Swedish military intelligence concluded the objects were real and beyond known technology. 2 years later, his own analysts at Project Sign, working under the authority of the man who wrote "The Phenomenon is Something Real," reached the same conclusion the Swedes had reached. They put it in writing. They classified it top secret. They sent it to Vandenberg. He rejected it. He cited lack of physical proof. He returned the document to Air Materiel Command, and according to one source, he had it declassified and burned. Every copy was destroyed. Or at least, every copy was supposed to be destroyed. Ruppelt later wrote that a few copies survived for a time in the files at Wright-Patterson. He personally saw them. By the time he went looking again years later, they were gone. The Air Force then denied the estimate had ever existed. In 1966 congressional hearings, representatives asked about it. The answer from L. Mendel Rivers: no such document had ever been produced. So, why? We have set up the paradox. Now we owe you the theories, because lack of physical proof is the stated reason, and stated reasons are not always the real ones. The first theory is the simplest. Take Vandenberg at his word. Sign had pilot testimony. They had radar data. They had pattern analysis and the Swedish assessment. What they did not have was a piece of hardware, no debris, no recovered object, no physical specimen that could be examined in a laboratory. Intelligence analysis without physical proof is assessment, not evidence. Vandenberg may have believed genuinely that concluding extraterrestrial from observations alone was a leap his institution could not make and should not make. This is the most charitable reading. It is also the reading that does not explain why you would destroy the document rather than simply reject its conclusion and send the analyst back for more evidence. The second theory is institutional. The United States Air Force was 13 months old when the estimate landed on Vandenberg's desk. 13 months. The National Security Act had created it as an independent branch in July of 1947. Its entire reason for existing, the argument that justified splitting it from the Army, was air superiority. The Air Force controlled the sky. That was the product. That was the budget line. That was why Congress funded it. If the Air Force officially concluded that objects of unknown origin were operating freely in American airspace, outperforming every interceptor in the inventory, performing maneuvers no known aircraft could replicate, what does that say about the institution's core mission? It says the thing we exist to do, we cannot do. For a 13-month-old institution fighting the Army and Navy for its share of the defense budget, that admission could be fatal. You do not tell Congress you cannot control the airspace and then ask Congress for money to control the airspace. The third theory is strategic. Even if the objects were not Soviet, publicly acknowledging that something unidentified was operating in your airspace creates a vulnerability. We have already seen the CIA's assessment from this period, concerned that the Soviet Union could exploit American fascination with flying saucers to touch off mass hysteria and panic, or flood the air defense warning system to mask a nuclear first strike. You do not need to know what the objects are to know that admitting you cannot explain them is a weakness your adversary can use. Projecting control, even false control, had Cold War strategic value. The fourth theory is about the public. If the Air Force says, "We believe these objects are extraterrestrial," what happens the next morning? Congressional hearings, a press frenzy that makes the summer of 1947 look calm. Public demands for answers the military does not have. Religious panic, economic disruption. The institutional calculation may have been straightforward. It is better to suppress a conclusion you cannot manage than to release one you cannot contain. And the fifth theory. This is the one researchers return to most often. Destroying the estimate at one classification level does not necessarily mean the conclusion was abandoned. It may mean it was moved to a higher one. Years later, in 1969, Air Force Brigadier General C.H. Bolander signed a memo confirming that UFO reports, which could affect national security, were not part of the Blue Book system. They went somewhere else, through separate channels, at higher classification. If that parallel track existed in 1969, the question is when it began. Vandenberg may not have rejected the estimate's conclusion. He may have buried it where fewer people could see it, and where the people who could see it did not have to explain themselves to Congress or the press. We do not know which of these theories is correct. We may never know. What we do know is what happened next, and what happened next is consistent with more than one of them. What followed the destruction of the estimate was systematic. On April 27, 1949, the Air Force publicly released a paper from the Intelligence Division of Air Materiel Command. The paper stated that almost all cases could be explained by conventional causes. The extraterrestrial hypothesis was absent. Not rejected, not debated, simply absent, as if it had never been considered. The main contributors to Project Sign were reassigned. Ruppelt's word for it was purged. Charter members of the project who refused to change their original opinions about UFOs were removed. The investigation had reached a conclusion the institution found unacceptable. The institution's response was to remove the people who reached it. On February 11, 1949, Project Grudge officially replaced Project Sign. New name, new personnel, new mandate. And the mandate was explicit. Ruppelt described it in Chapter 5 of his book, a chapter he titled The Dark Ages. His words. Standard intelligence procedures were no longer being used by Project Grudge. Everything was being evaluated on the premise that UFOs could not exist. No matter what you see or hear, don't believe it. Project Grudge was not an investigation. It was a conclusion in search of supporting evidence. The mission was to explain, dismiss, or ignore. When a sighting could be attributed to a known object, it was. When it could not, it was attributed to a mild form of mass hysteria and war nerves, or to individuals who fabricated reports to perpetuate a hoax or seek publicity, or to psychopathological persons. The categories were tidy: misidentification, hysteria, hoax, mental illness. Every sighting that came in was sorted into one of 4 buckets. The possibility that the objects were real and unexplained was no longer on the menu. And yet, even operating under this mandate, with every institutional incentive to close every case, Project Grudge acknowledged that 23% of its reports could not be explained. 23%, nearly 1 in 4. Acknowledged in writing and then ignored. The reports were filed. No further analysis was conducted. No follow-up investigations were ordered. The unexplained quarter of the caseload simply sat there, in the files, accumulating. While the Air Force was dismantling its investigation, the FBI was running a parallel operation that had its own logic. During the period from 1947 through 1950, the FBI received many UFO reports and worked jointly with the Air Force on selected cases. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had ordered his agents to verify sightings at the Air Force's request. Field offices across the country were collecting witness testimony, forwarding it to Air Force intelligence, and filing their own copies. But the FBI's primary interest was not the objects, it was the witnesses. Internal FBI records describe a pattern of what researchers have called compartmentalized dismissal. The Bureau would take a sighting report from a witness, forward the technical details to the Air Force, and then use the encounter as a pretext to conduct a character investigation of the person who reported it. Were they a security risk? Did they have subversive associations? Was the sighting report itself a cover for espionage or foreign intelligence activity? The phenomenon was, for Hoover's FBI, a counterintelligence lens. The objects in the sky were less interesting than the people looking at them. In July of 1950, Hoover ended FBI participation entirely. Years later, in a 1958 letter, he was blunt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not investigate sightings of unidentified flying objects. And then there is the Hottel Memo. On March 22, 1950, Guy Hottel, the special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office, wrote a memo relaying a third-hand claim from an Air Force investigator. The claim? 3 flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico, each approximately 50 feet in diameter, each containing 3 bodies of humanoid form, approximately 3 feet tall, dressed in a fine metallic cloth. The memo concludes, no further evaluation was attempted by S.A. Hottel. That memo is the most viewed document in the FBI vault. The FBI itself has publicly stated it is an unverified report based on third-hand information. We include it because it exists in the official record and because it illustrates the gap between what was being filed internally and what the public was being told. A document describing recovered craft with non-human bodies was sitting in FBI files in Washington, D.C., while the Air Force was telling reporters that every sighting had a conventional explanation. We are claiming nothing about the Hottel memo's accuracy. We are noting that it was written, filed, and classified, and that nobody followed up. While the Air Force debunked and the FBI looked the other way, the CIA was watching. Throughout the late 1940s, the Office of Scientific Intelligence monitored the Air Force's UFO investigations. The CIA accepted the Air Force's explanations, but maintained engagement for a specific reason. A CIA assessment from this period used a phrase that carries real weight: the remote possibility that they may be interplanetary aircraft. Remote, but not zero. And not zero was enough to keep the intelligence community's attention. The CIA's primary fear was operational, and it was Soviet. Agency analysts noted something curious: the complete absence of UFO reports in the Soviet press. In the United States, saucers were headline news. In the Soviet Union, silence. The CIA concluded this was a deliberate government policy. Their concern took 2 forms. First, that the Soviet Union could exploit American public fascination with flying saucers to touch off mass hysteria and panic. Second, and more concretely, that a flood of UFO reports could overwhelm the air defense warning system. If the Soviets launched a nuclear first strike during a wave of saucer sightings, the early warning network might be too saturated with false reports to detect the real attack. The UFO problem, for the CIA, was not about what the objects were. It was about what the public's reaction to them could be used for. That distinction would shape everything that came next. The Dark Ages ended the way they began, with radar. On September 10, 1951, a student radar operator at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, was running a training exercise when something entered his scope. The AN-MPG-1 radar's automatic tracking system, designed to follow fighter jets, could not keep up. The target was moving too fast. On September 11th, pilots near Sandy Hook reported a silver disc-shaped object. A T-33 trainer jet attempted pursuit. The object outpaced it. On September 12th, radar tracked another object at extreme altitude over Point Pleasant. 3 days, 3 incidents, one of the most sensitive radar installations in the country. The reports reached Lieutenant General Charles P. Cabell, Director of Air Force Intelligence, the same Cabell who had presided over the split house when the estimate came across his desk. Cabell looked at the Fort Monmouth reports. Then he looked at what Project Grudge had been producing for the past 3 years. Then he called an emergency briefing at the Pentagon. According to Ruppelt, who was present, Cabell demanded to know why sightings were piling up with no serious investigation. Why was his intelligence directorate running a project that existed on paper but produced nothing of value? Cabell was joined by Brigadier General William Garland, newly assigned to his staff. Garland brought something unusual. He had personally seen a UFO, a general officer, career military, his own sighting, his own eyes. He was not a believer in any particular theory. He was a man who had seen something he could not explain and believed the question deserved the same analytical rigor the Air Force applied to any other intelligence problem. Together, Cabell and Garland ordered the overhaul. Project Grudge would be dismantled. A new investigation would begin, with real authority, real standards, and a leader who had not already decided the answer. The man they chose was a 30-year-old captain with 2 distinguished flying crosses and a degree in aeronautical engineering, Edward Ruppelt, the person who would build the investigation that the phenomenon finally deserved.
This episode is sponsored by What's Near Me Now. Visit nearmenow.us to find events near you.
Here's what we can state about the evidence presented in this episode. Confirmed, the Twining Memo of September 23, 1947, assessed the phenomenon as something real and not visionary or fictitious, and recommended a formal investigation with a security classification and code name. The distribution list included 6 agencies. The full text is declassified. Confirmed, Project Sign was established at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in late 1947 under Twining's authority. J. Allen Hynek was hired as the project's astronomical consultant. The Chiles-Whitted encounter occurred on July 24, 1948. Both pilots filed matching reports, corroborated by a ground witness. Confirmed, Project Grudge replaced Project Sign in February 1949. Grudge personnel operated under a debunking mandate. Ruppelt's account of the mandate and the purge of Sign personnel is detailed and specific. Despite the mandate, Grudge acknowledged 23% of reports could not be explained. Confirmed, the FBI worked jointly with the Air Force on UFO cases from 1947 through 1950. The Guy Hottel memo of March 22, 1950, exists in the FBI vault and describes recovered craft with non-human occupants. The FBI has publicly stated it is unverified. Confirmed, the CIA monitored Air Force UFO investigations throughout the late 1940s. CIA assessments from this period reference the remote possibility that they may be interplanetary aircraft and express concern about Soviet exploitation of American public interest. Confirmed, Fort Monmouth radar incidents occurred September 10th through 12th, 1951. General Cabell ordered a complete overhaul of Project Grudge following these incidents. Probable, the estimate of the situation existed as described by Ruppelt. He is a highly credible single source with first-hand access. The circumstantial evidence, the purge of Sign personnel, the shift to the Grudge debunking mandate, is consistent with a suppressed conclusion. No copy has been independently verified. Here's what we do not know. Was the estimate of the situation real? We have presented the evidence on both sides. Ruppelt's credibility is substantial. His account is internally consistent and explains the institutional behavior that followed. The counter-argument is that a single source, however credible, is a single source. This is an open thread in our investigation. Why did Vandenberg reject it? He cited lack of physical proof. But in 1946, he personally briefed the president on objects that also lacked physical proof. He took those objects seriously. What changed? Was it the political implications of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the effect on military budgets, the fear of public panic? Or did Vandenberg receive information between 1946 and 1948 that altered his assessment? The record does not say. What happened to the purged Sign personnel? Ruppelt says charter members were removed for refusing to change their conclusions. Their names, beyond Captain Robert Snyder, are largely absent from the public record. Where did they go? Did any of them speak? Their testimony, if it exists, would be significant corroboration. And what did Grudge's 23% actually contain? Nearly 1 in 4 reports could not be explained even by analysts whose explicit mission was to explain everything. What was in those files? Were any of them investigated further? Or did they simply sit in a cabinet at Wright-Patterson, accumulating dust while the Air Force told the public that the mystery was solved? In 18 months, the United States Air Force went from "the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious" to "no matter what you see or hear, don't believe it." The institutional distance between those two statements is extraordinary. The Twining Memo and the Grudge debunking mandate came from the same institution, the same building, the same intelligence apparatus. The difference was not the evidence. The evidence had grown stronger. The difference was what the institution was willing to accept. The Dark Ages would not last forever. By 1951, generals who had seen things with their own eyes would demand accountability. A young captain with an engineering mind and no patience for predetermined conclusions would be given the authority to start over. He would coin a term that is still used today. He would commission the most rigorous statistical analysis of the phenomenon ever attempted, and for 18 months, the investigation would be real. Every source cited in this episode is linked at unresolvedsignals.com. If you have a document we have not seen, a connection we missed, or a correction we need to make, the submission portal is open. A note on how this show is made. Unresolved Signals is produced using artificial intelligence and human editorial oversight. AI is a powerful research and production tool. It is also a tool that can and does make mistakes. We will do everything in our power to ensure that every detail we share is backed by real research and real sources. Our job is to find the connections across thousands of documents in dozens of languages that no single person could process alone. When we get something wrong, we will correct it publicly. Every source is linked at unresolvedsignals.com, where you can read the original documents yourself and check our work. If you'd like to sponsor this show or partner with Unresolved Signals, visit unresolvedsignals.com/sponsor.
Unresolved Signals is produced by Talentless AI, produced and directed by Steve Mudd, research compiled and cross-referenced using Google Notebook LM, narration generated by 11 Labs, research coordination, script writing, and source verification by Claude. Original source documents accessed through government archives, university collections, and public repositories worldwide. This has been Unresolved Signals. Every document, every country, every question, every release. Next time on Unresolved Signals, Blue Book, The Rise. When the Air Force finally asked the question honestly,